Hello. Following 18 sessions of Legendary Lives, Robbie, Ross, Rod, and I wanted to have a get-together session for debrief and decompression, perhaps little analysis. Well, it is the holidays and we're all busy, and so I guess we're kind of jumping in on this individually as Robbie has begun with this post. So I'll provide my end of it. Maybe it's a good idea that each of us gets an individual piece here, and then we can use that. That way we don't have to just repeat stuff that we all know each other and speechify. See what we think together when we eventually do get that session. Okay, well, I have 3 parts. The first is one that you may have seen here already, which has to do with character creation. I began our game with a one-off of just making up a character for fun, and that turned out to be Shining Star, and then that prompted Ross saying, hey, let's make a game, play Shining Star in it, and then we did that. Well, you've probably seen that I've talked about making Legendary Lives characters with Simon and Jared when they were visiting here, and how that went. And I've played it before, and anyway, it's pretty much a given. The character creation system is just a knockout. And its features that I've talked about include the remarkable amount of random effects that your own creativity responds to, very carefully placed points of choice along the sequence that make the intense, almost ubiquitous randomness click. Is kind of a triumph, and I've never really seen it fail in terms of making somebody, very playable. You end up with a pretty functional array of non-player characters, whether friends or enemies or relatives, and a backstory for the character, which is, if anything, overflowing with complicated conflicts, obligations, tends to make the character, number one, ready to go, ready to do something. You look at the character and like, all right, I am going here, I am doing this. You even have a stated goal as part of character creation, but it's only one of all the things that they have to cope with. It's kind of like top of the list. Now, the other thing that you get is through this random kind of thing, has to do with the religions. So your character has a race. The race has a whole range of religion and sects and stuff usually, and you've rolled for that too, so you kind of know where your character sits relative to their religion. But then you have this religious lifeline roll, which often, well, it either intensifies or often problematizes your character's relationship to that religion. And all of a sudden, some of the sort of stereotypical or kind of stock, sometimes a little almost like offensive details of those particular religions as written in the book, the whole point is for them to be like that so that your character's intensified or problematized relationship to it becomes individually interesting. So all of a sudden, instead of saying, oh, well, that's my character's religion, it says I'm like this, it says I'm like that, all right, well, I guess I have to be. And then you roll your religious lifeline, you're saying, oh, except my character has this relationship with that, this history and perspective with that. I've been declared a heretic, or I have been, I've been accused of heresy on true charges. So I am a heretic, or something like that. And so it's much more than just rolling on random tables and finding out what you get and being landed with it. You have to click these things together, and your guy is really your guy. Okay, so to stay with the character creation, and the options. The game is simultaneously whimsical and has a little bit of depth that are both off-center for fantasy role-playing. So the whimsy is a little different from the usual kind of whimsy that you see across fantasy role-playing games. That I'm not really going to go into that in all that detail. We can talk all about, I mean, I've got tons of stuff on what fantasy means in role-playing. But Legendary Lives does something a little different with its whimsy. And it does the same a little differently with its depth. Let's take a look at both of those. So for the whimsy, it begins with the races, because it, the word is treated extremely loosely, as is typical, and it clearly applies to different human cultures, as well as the other, groups like draconians or elves or stuff. You also have these differing human cultures, and what's striking is the complete absence of anything like humans in a fantasy role-playing game. They're just not there. You have just this array of strangeness. Hollywood pirates, very, very Little Abner, mid-20th century notions of hillbillies. Very kind of storybook gypsies, and 1980s Conan the Barbarians, and I could go on. There's a bunch, curiously, impressively spiritual Neanderthals, and there's, like I said, a whole bunch. That's just half of them about for the human weirdness. And so with all of those sort of scattered through, then you bolt onto that a bunch of races, and again, each one with sort of a mix and match of religions and often overlapping, that come straight out of British folklore and Irish and Scottish, well, British Isles folklore. And that is matched also by some of the societal stuff, and also by the various creatures in particular draw very directly from that. And now that I think about it, also most of the herbal magic stuff, and the herbal stuff is huge in this game. So somebody basically lifted up the great big book of fairy British folklore, opened it up, and just went to town, turning it into options and rules. And so you have the Sidhe, you've got the Unseelie Court, you got the elves, you got the half-elves. I mean, you got the brownies, and you got the Spriggans, and it goes on and on. I mean, you've got quite this. I mean, that in and of itself really could be a very focused role-playing setting, thing. So you've kind of got that now thrown chunk with that array of semi-comedic or semi-spiritual or semi-referential, definitely non-unified constellation of humanity. And then finally, you've got a third angle on the whimsy, which is kind of the Sidewinder stuff. I mean, wham, these monster draconian humanoids with their weird blood or jewel cults. And a few of the others. There's a number of kind of throw it in there, this group of winged humans, a bunch of sort of little throw-it-inners that round it out, so that you're saying, well, what am I doing with this? Oh, back to the humans, really. I mean, it can't help but mention the extremely Arab nomads, and they're not technically humans, they're serpentines, walking snake people, but man, are they Jewish in the most frightening way. I mean, as I say, borderline offensive. And you're looking at, all these things and going, wow, what are we looking at? Is this, how tolerable is this? How incoherent is it on paper? I mean, it's pretty striking. You're going, whoa, what a mess. And then you make a character, and because of that individualizing quality, it's almost as though, okay, here's this mess, and then wham, here I am, and I'm not a mess. I actually have my guy in a highly individualized, highly goal-oriented, position in this. And so, as I say, this curious mix of whimsy that emerges from that, so that it actually kind of makes sense that Christabel, Rod's character, wears overalls, and then when she goes to a party, she puts on a gingham dress, and you kind of swallow hard and say, well, okay, yeah, we're in the elven court, and it looks pretty elfy, and that's the kind of fantasy we're doing. It's self-referential without being contemptuous toward either the topic or the activity of role-playing it. I've never really seen anything quite snap together like that without being absurd. So it is its own form of fantasy. There must be a name for that, which I'm kind of getting, really.